if it's fiction, it shouldn't be your first source of information. That it shouldn't be playing that role in culture, which it is regularly. So numbers vary, but at least 60 characters from the Bible, first known from the Bible, then found in archaeology.
I am so appreciative of your time and for you being willing to have this chat from across the pond with just an ordinary American like myself. But I really am excited to talk with you about the Bible, the reliability of the New Testament and the Old Testament, your conversation with Bart Ehrman. It's going to be good. I'm really happy to have you here.
I'm looking forward to it.
I saw you first on the Unbelievable program with Justin Brierley, who I also had on this podcast, and really appreciate Justin and everything that they did over there. And I thought that the conversation that you had with Bart Ehrman around the reliability of the Gospels was really interesting, because I feel that it really allowed the viewer to hear both sides of that. I guess I wanted to just maybe let's start from the beginning here. Can you, for those who are not as familiar with this, sort of just walk us through the case for the reliability of the Gospels at sort of a bird's eye view? I hear this all the time, and I even watch programs like Joe Rogan or something, and the common cultural view is that because they're thousands of years old, because they're sort of religious in nature, there's clearly foul play here. There's distortion. It's like the game of telephone. But you as a historian, I'm just curious, what's your basically case for this?
I think you can make lots of different cases for the New Testament. You could work from the person of Jesus, who I think is going to be really hard to invent. Or you can work from the sort of historical knowledge that they have in the Gospels. That's the way I've chosen to do things. To some extent, it's difficult to see it as something like a mathematical equation that you can make, which makes the case for reliability. People are going to jump in one of two different ways, but they have to explain the data. And certainly what we can say from the four Gospels is the four writers clearly knew a lot about the time and space that Jesus was. So we can look at their geographical, their cultural knowledge, all that sort of stuff, and they do very well. I'd say that the Gospels are written close enough to the events to be reliable and far enough away from the events to be unreliable. So that's something you've got to realize. And a lot, rather than trying to score points over this, something can be written 5 minutes after the event and be a pack of lies, or something can be written 100 years after the event and be true. So you actually have to sort of dig down. They're certainly close enough to the events to be able to get reliable information. And then when you start looking at the patterns that you have of, say, the way Jesus speaks, and he's telling parables as his main story. That's an interesting thing, because the early Christians aren't using parables. So how do you get the sort of layering there of something presented as earlier when there's parables and then later without parables? The Jesus they present doesn't tell them how to run a church service, doesn't tell them what to do about getting Gentiles in. So again, he speaks in quite distinctive ways. He's got levels of creative genius, which are quite high, whether you're looking at his actual storytelling or radical ideas like love your enemies. That's a very radical idea, not plotted in any human literature up to that point, and then just suddenly comes along, or do unto others what you'd have them do to you. Those are quite interesting things. He talks a lot about hypocrisy, which is a fascinating thing, because again, no one's really been talking about that in the human race up until his point. So it's a very creative, insightful thing, this whole issue of double standards, of the way humans wear actors' masks, I think is really interesting. So you've got to explain how that comes along. How does that sort of creativity come along? You've got to explain the story of Jesus as it's got this climactic movement towards the cross and resurrection. Now you can say, okay, that's made up. But the interesting thing is it sort of makes a story climax with the beginning of the Old Testament, where you've got this scene at a tree, which is like a cross, and death coming into the world. And that's an amazing sort of thing. It seems from non-Christian sources, Jewish sources, that Jesus died on the eve of Passover, just when the Jews are celebrating their greatest deliverance. So you've got various things coming together, and it seems like it's more than coincidence. So that's the way I would sort of build up a case of what way do you have explaining it. Now, typically, a sort of skeptic or atheist, or they see themselves as skeptic, they're selectively skeptical, I suppose, say they sort of fold their arms and say, well, it's your job to prove to me that supernatural can happen. And they're sometimes thinking in that sort of Sherlock Holmes sense that once you've eliminated the impossible, and whatever's left, however improbable, must be the truth. And given that miracles are impossible, therefore, we know that can't be true. But that isn't a really rational way of looking at things, because what I would argue is that Jesus is making a pattern which is a recognizable pattern. It's a signal pattern. So we're not arguing for random miracles, but for miracles that make a pattern. And an analogy I sometimes give is with people being colorblind. If there are 8 billion people on the planet and you are the one person who is colorblind, they tell you that colors exist, and on their testimony you say, okay, I believe that. Imagine if everyone on the planet bar you said that they had actually experienced a miracle. At that point, you would be inclined to say, okay, miracles exist, I just happen to be one of the people who hasn't seen one. So I think that there's no particular rational ground for objecting to miracles, but per se. So I suppose that I've laid out a few things there, but that's I'll start off with that.
I believe that you just referenced that color blindness analogy that you did, because earlier this week in the Wisdom Society, which is sort of an online community that I host, we read the story of the person who was blind from birth being healed. And in the course of that conversation, we sort of unfolded this analogy where it's pretty much what you just said, but imagine a person is physically blind from birth and you're tasked with explaining to them the color green. And they would, from their perspective, they would say there's zero evidence for it. Just show me the evidence, show me the proof. Where is the color green? Of course, the problem isn't that the color green doesn't exist, but it's that individual's perspective is limited. They're blind, and then it raises the case about spiritual blindness. I mean, I don't know, this is now we're off on a rabbit trail here, but if someone is spiritually blind, if they don't have eyes to see, as Jesus said, then is it something similar to the person physically blind, unable to see the color green? If you're spiritually blind, do you just not have eyes to see what is otherwise obvious to you, even to the extent of crucifying the Lord on the cross?
Oh, I mean, I do think so. I think there's something paradigmatic about whether you see it or you get it or not. It's a bit like those hidden images you get where you have to focus your eyes behind the actual piece of paper in order to see something. And I think that some of that's going on. I mean, people who call themselves skeptics typically are not skeptical about their own philosophy or beliefs on origins, or the how values come into existence, these sort of things, or how consciousness comes into existence. Often they're quite uncritical about those sort of things. They're just selectively critical. I'd love to just start talking about the person of Jesus and how they would explain that. And if they're going to say, well, it's all made up, I want to say, by whom, when, give me some scenario, and how does it compare with other creativity that we see down history, fiction, whether it's Charles Dickens or anyone else. What's actually going on? And I would say, what you have in the Gospels is a remarkable 9-hour set of texts in terms of the creativity they show, and also the inner patterns. So that there are 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that are more similar. John's somewhat different. But then you've got an overlap between Matthew and Luke. You've got overlap between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You've got overlaps between different Gospels. So you get at least 6 major relationships between Gospel materials and some minor relationships as well. And that allows you to test all sorts of theories about how they arose. And a lot of the time, grand ideas that might work to someone who doesn't know very much just won't explain what we've got.
Can you help the audience and also myself understand a little bit more about that? The fact that there are overlaps between the Gospels, that it seems like someone was borrowing from someone. And I know that even in and of itself, the idea that there is so much similarity in some people's mind raises suspicion, and they view it as a piece of the case against the reliability of the Gospels.
I mean, you can run it either way. I would say similarity of itself doesn't particularly say anything.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can look at someone like Socrates, and you can have a Plato version of Socrates, or you can have a Xenophon version of Socrates, and they can be really quite different. And you look at other people we've got multiple biographies for, and I'd say the norm is more the sort of difference you have between Luke and John. Really, quite different. So then we got to explain why we got Matthew, Mark, and Luke more similar. And I would say, in one sense, it's a bit of a bonanza. I sometimes use this exercise. Imagine you had 4 Gospels, and let's call one big A and another one small a, another one big B, and the other one small b. And big A came first, big B came first, and then, in fact, you've got 4 Gospels, but you've really only got 2 sources, big A and big B. That's it. What we've got with the 4 Gospels and the pattern of relationships is about the most optimal system you can have to show, to be able to analyze data from lots of different angles, because you have, say, a Matthew-Luke overlap, but you have lots of things only in Luke, lots of things only in Matthew. You got a Matthew-Mark-Luke overlap. You get each of them overlapping at points with John. And you get Mark-Luke overlap, Mark-Matthew overlap. You start having all these different sorts of material. And that becomes very interesting, because a simple explanation like A copied B doesn't actually explain things. And this is why in the scholarship, I mean, it goes round in circles. So there's a major view that says Mark comes first and Matthew and Luke both use him. But again, it doesn't then explain about 2,000 minor agreements that you have between Matthew and Luke. So in order to account for all the data, you're going to need something more complex. I'm not proposing a particular solution, but what I can say is this isn't what you get from a simplistic idea that there's only like one strand of information about Jesus or 2.
Can you walk us through, beginning from the historic events themselves, the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus happens. Then there's the road to Emmaus. He's there for 40 days. And then there's the ascension, according to Scripture. From that point forward to when things were codified and written down, canonized. I know that's kind of a tall order, but just to help people understand, what went on historically, and how is it different or not different than how any other historic event is recorded?
Yeah, so the crucifixion is portrayed in the Gospels, but also the death of Jesus is portrayed in the Talmud, the Jewish traditions, as happening on the eve of Passover. And the Gospels portray it as happening on a Friday. And if you're looking for a time during Pontius Pilate's governorship from 26 to about 37, for a time when you get a Friday Passover, you're looking, generally most people would say, either the year 30 or the year 33. Now, there are some, outlying views on that, and it's going to get all technical and astronomical, and I don't know much about that. But those are going to be your 2 main dates. So that sort of gives you a start for Christianity. Then you've got these 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the interesting thing is they come with names on, not with dates on. And so a lot of people say, when were the Gospels written? Look, my granny is 104. And so, I realize that's quite old. And, I saw her a couple of days ago. She's doing just fine. And I can get information from her, like she was telling me the other day about before the Second World War, when she was driving her aunt over 90 miles an hour, about 90 miles an hour, and then she corrected herself to 80. That's stories from over 80 years ago. So I think it's not so much a question of the time as you can sort of dig down in the Gospels and see whether they are reliable. What we can say in the case of Mark and Luke, both of which are Latin names, interestingly, is that neither of those figures would be well known if it weren't for their writings. So it's like say J.K. Rowling becomes famous because of her writings. She didn't put her name on the cover of the Harry Potter books in order to sell them. It's rather that they sold and she became famous. And I think that's really what happened with Matthew and Mark and Luke. And because they're not either of the 12 disciples, neither of them are from the 12 disciples, there's no particular motive to put those names on. So I think they're authentic, and the tradition is Luke's a doctor. That makes sense. He certainly seems to use lots of medical terminology and speak that sort of way. And Mark is said to be an interpreter of Peter. Now, what that gives you is a sort of lifetime, because if Luke is hanging around with the Apostle Paul, and Apostle Paul is active in the 50s and 60s, then Luke needs to be, active at that point. People don't generally live super long times. I mean, occasionally they do. You get ancient reports of people living 100 years, but it's not just generally. Most people are going to be living less than 50 years. So that's where a natural date to put it is within his lifetime, in the 50s or 60s for Luke's gospel. Now, a lot of people would put it later, and Luke and Acts are really 2 volumes. The thing about that is, that the writer of Acts has got the same style as the Gospel of Luke, so it's the same author, but also knows the Mediterranean pretty well from a travel perspective. And if Luke doesn't actually write that himself, during the 50s or 60s, you have to imagine someone basically paying to do an expensive voyage around the Mediterranean to pick up information in order to write a fictional book in the 80s or 90s, which hasn't got that much chance of taking off. So that's why I feel just Matthew and Mark and Luke, the authorship can be quite solid. I could give you some more arguments on that. Matthew and John are both names of the 12 disciples. Matthew is said to be a tax collector. That's an interesting thing, tax collectors being somewhat unpopular. But also he mentions loads of money stuff that isn't in the other Gospels. He mentions the treasure of the wise men, the temple tax in chapter 17, the parable of the talents, the bribe given to the soldiers, the money given by Judas Iscariot. All of these things come up in Matthew and only in Matthew. And so that's an interesting thing. It sort of fits with that. And again, it has to be in the lifetime of someone who was collecting tax before he becomes a disciple of Jesus, so around the year 30. So again, you don't want to push that too late. John is generally thought to be the longest, the latest gospel, and that makes a lot of sense. There's debate about when exactly it was written. Was it written before the year 70? Because after all, in chapter 5, it says there is in Jerusalem a particular sort of pool, and Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. So, or is it written later, and there's a tradition of him living in towards the late 1st century? All of that makes sense. What we can say is that certainly the writer of John's Gospel knows the local language. That's an interesting thing. He knows stuff about Jerusalem before it was destroyed. So knowing that there is this pool with 5 colonnades mentioned in chapter 5, that was destroyed in the year 70. So that's an interesting piece of information. So I would just say, all of the gospel writers, when they use the verbs like come up and come down, go down, are using it right for the topography of the Holy Land. That's not an easy thing to get right if you're away from there. They're getting traveling distances right. They're getting cultural issues right. So that's all interesting, and certainly not what you'd expect from fiction. And I suppose there's one more thing to say in all of this, and that is that the Gospels give you factual details that are then later corroborated by history. So a lot of people are pretty skeptical about Luke talking about the census in the days of Caesar Augustus and then Quirinius. Well, what I can say from this is, if you go back in the sort of history of human knowledge to the 19th century, we didn't know that Romans did censuses at all, other than from Luke's Gospel. Then the archaeology comes about. People discover stuff from Egypt in papyrus, and they find out, they actually did censuses, and guess what? They began in the time of Augustus. So in a sense, if it's a fictional narrative, it's rather striking that it's our first source of information that we now believe. And that's an argument you can use quite a bit with the Old Testament when we get onto that often the Old Testament was the first thing to mention things that we now believe, and show in museums.
Can I highlight two things from what you've just stated, and then feel free to tell me if I'm getting something wrong, because I'm often prone to do that, but maybe someone in the audience is thinking along these lines as well. And I just want to highlight this, that it sounds like embedded within what you're saying that if there's a name on there, that the burden of proof would be to explain why it's not that name.
Yes, and I think there are a few more layers to this.
Okay.
Gospels become a popular genre 150 years after Christianity has begun. You get these apocryphal gospels and so on, but they're actually a starting genre when they first get written, and that's an interesting thing. They're like a biography, but people at the time only wrote biographies of people who have been long dead or who have Roman elites. So it's surprising that you would get as many biographies written of Jesus as you have of the Roman emperor at the time, Tiberius. That's already something that's got to be explained. If it's easy with hindsight to say, oh, they were bound to be successful, but that isn't obvious with foresight. That this is so it's not that you talk about grifters nowadays, people who are basically trying to get onto a cause which they think is going to help them boost their own standing. There's no obvious way of grifting in early Christianity. It looks to be on a losing path. This is shortens your life and so on. So I think that's got to be pointed out when we think about how these sort of books arise.
That's really helpful. And then I just want to, again, sort of underscore an implication that I think is there within what you were just saying, which is that basically if the historic record and the manuscript and everything is pointing us to these writers being early, really living in that time period, really living in the lifetime of people who knew Jesus, or in the case of, I think you were talking about Mark, was actually sitting there shoulder to shoulder with Peter and sort of transcribing, or however you want to say that, was writing down the recollection of Peter. If that is the case, then is one significant point therein that religion can't emerge when people can just go and fact check the claim that's being made.
I have to be careful here because, of course, we have all sorts of myths going around the internet when there's loads of opportunity to fact check and somehow spread anyway.
Good point.
So what I'd say, though, is in the case of Mark, we can look at the little bits of the language where, for instance, when he talks about a Garden of Gethsemane, that's a striking thing because that's a particular bit of language. Geth and Semene. Geth is a press, and Semene is the word for oil. And guess what? It's on the Mount of Olives where you're producing oil. And so you've got that sort of bit of local knowledge that fits exactly with where we know there are oil trees, or olive trees. And so it's just that sort of thing where you say, well, that's not made up. And then you've still got to explain how you get a parable of the sower, how you get the countercultural teaching about it's what comes from inside that defiles you, not stuff from the outside, which is in Mark's gospel. All those sorts of things where it's not an obvious way to fake a story. And I also think that you could look at the way Matthew and Mark both refer to the Sea of Galilee, which is only 5 miles wide at its widest point, as the Sea of Galilee. And, Matthew's a guy who worked just on the shore as a tax collector, and Mark is supposed to get his information from Peter, who fishes on it. And then you've got Luke, who traditionally is said to be born near the Mediterranean, who just calls it the Lake of Galilee. Because, he grew up near a big sea, and that's just a lake. And so they're referring to things exactly the way you'd expect the characters to do that. And every time they say, the other side, they went over to the other side on a ship, they are telling it from the perspective of someone on the shore, which is exactly right. We might look from a sort of satellite view down onto it. But they got that sort of information correct. Jesus says something like, if anyone offends one of these little ones, it'd be better if a millstone were hung around his neck and he was, cast into the sea. Well, he's saying that in Capernaum, and you can go to Capernaum and see a ton of millstones on the shore. And just this is part of the culture that they would know, and someone, 50 miles away, 100 miles away wouldn't. So I think that's where you start having to explain how that all arises.
So you're saying you're bringing out all of those details to say that the idea that it was someone far away in time and space wouldn't have been able to act to that level of accuracy, write a story with those details.
I think that's right. I mean, with the internet now, of course, we can do research and can do better historical fiction. But it's still pretty hard if you've not visited a place, because even though I look places up on the internet before I go, and I even walk round, Google Street View and all sorts of things, I'm still surprised when I actually get on the ground, because Google Street View hasn't been showing me the noises or the smells or all sorts of things. So I think it is phenomenally difficult to think how you would fake this sort of reporting that you have in the Gospels.
That's really helpful. And then I think I worded the question poorly like 2 or 3 questions ago, whenever that was. And I don't even know if this is your area of expertise. So if it's not, then we can move past this. But what I was aiming at was from that first. So let's just use Mark and Peter together. And so something is being written down based on what Peter is sharing. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to get a picture of is from that point in time into the future, what did that look like until we get the manuscripts that we had? And basically how much detail, how much information do we know about how long did that process of writing it down take? Yeah. What was it written on? Just for people to, because I think in a lot of people's mind, it's like, oh, it happened in a galaxy far, far away. And it's like a very hand-waving dismissal. But I'm curious, just how much do we know about that process?
Yeah, so we know a lot more than we used to. So you go back a few hundred years, and it's a funny thing, people were prepared to trust the text of the New Testament, even though they had a far less evidence. Now we know that people are generally using leather or papyrus. Lots of that survives, and a lot of it survives in Egypt, where in southern Egypt, where the climate is very dry. And so you get papyrus. Now, the interesting thing is the earliest complete copy of all 4 Gospels is in the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus. I'll be seeing it a couple of weeks' time, and it's all out on the web. Mm. You might say, well, there's a lot of things that could change between then and the 1st century. Absolutely, of course. But let's remember, I mean, I've got a whole load of these green and red volumes on my shelf are various bits of classical literature. And a lot of the time they are from 1,000 years after the writer, and it seems to be reliably handed down because it's the right sort of Greek. I recently discovered some of the earliest text of, a part of our team discovered the earliest text of this mathematician Eratosthenes, and it shows how little has changed, even though our manuscripts are 8 centuries earlier than the ones that turned up later. They're pretty similar. So what you can do, though, is you go back from the 4th century, and in the 3rd and the 2nd century, we have fragments, so generally in papyrus, not complete, but you can do an audit, if you like, and you can say, if we check these little bits and say we got a bit of John chapter 18 in Manchester, we got another bit of John chapter 18 in London, probably both from the 2nd century, we check those against the complete bits, are they basically stacking up and agreeing? And the answer is yes, they are agreeing. From the late 2nd century, people are starting to translate the Gospels. So there's someone called Tatian who, about by the year 175, has all 4 Gospels into Syriac, that's Eastern Aramaic. In the 3rd century, they're going to be in Latin. They're soon after that in Coptic, Gothic, lots of other languages. So it becomes almost impossible to change, because you'd have to travel around, and traveling's dangerous and big budget. And change loads of people's Bibles in order to, if you wanted to change anything. So what I'd say is we've got lots of evidence that the Gospel's been well transmitted. if people say, can you prove that things haven't changed? The answer is no, but then they're asking me to prove a negative. And there are all sorts of things that, proving negatives is phenomenally difficult. There's no reason to think that something has changed. So what I'd say is ancient society used to depend on copying, just as our society depends on delivery trucks delivering the food to the supermarkets at the right time. And so what we expect is that normally scribes do their job. They normally copy. I mean, you can falsify. It's an expensive thing because you're writing on animal skin or carefully prepared papyrus. To do it on any big scale is going to be really tough. So no, I can't prove that something hasn't changed, but I can prove there's no reason to think it has changed. And in all of the evidence that we have, we see no reason to think it's changed. And in my little book, Can We Trust the Gospels, I actually do a whole chapter on that, where we look at places where there are differences in the Gospels, and we try and give some quantity to that, and show the parameters in which your maximal skeptic view could fit.
Super interesting. This is sort of an out-of-pocket question for you, but I'm just curious your thoughts on this, because this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. If there was camera technology in the first century, and if we had a tripod shot of Jesus walking out of the tomb, do you think that would increase the level of belief, or do you think that, kind of like with the Bigfoot footage, there would be just a number of alternative similar theories and academic conversations around tampering and AI and all of that? I just wonder, because of the...
I think people, if you want to find a space for skepticism, you always can. And in fact, there are cases of this happening within the Gospels, where, for instance, it says a voice is heard from heaven and people say it's thundered. And the point is that you have this ambiguity to a lot of evidence, that if you want to find a way around it, you can. And you see this where people have alternative economic explanations or political explanations for what's going on. There's always, humans are incredibly ingenious. And so we rarely find that evidence is coercive, that it actually forces us to believe something we don't want to believe.
That's a great point. In fact, in that same passage in scripture that we were just reading this last week, where the man born blind was healed, one of the explanations was it's a different guy. It looks like him, but not the same guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, this is really good. Should we pivot into Old Testament, or?
Absolutely, yeah. Sure.
Okay. I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything else on this note that we should, drill down further into. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could go into, but I wanted to make sure that we didn't leave any hanging chads or anything along the way. So with the Old Testament now, my understanding, and again, not an academic, not trained in this, but just the sense that I have from, I guess, just the culture, is that we have basically less receipts or less reliable knowledge about the documents are, where they came from, than we do the Gospels. But I'm super curious about this.
I certainly think that there's more uncertainty as you go back into more ancient history on the whole. Mm-hmm. You get less documentation generally. So let's say if we're talking about the Roman Empire, we've just got more evidence than we're likely to have for, say, a Hittite Empire over 1,000 years before. There's still, plenty on both. And it's worth reflecting on what a tiny fraction of all that ever has existed actually survives archaeologically, because you need certain conditions to survive. But, and this is a really key thing with the Bible, one really helpful exercise you can do is imagine yourself before archaeology. So archaeology sort of begins, you could say Thomas Jefferson begins it in the New World, Napoleon in the Old World, where people, let's say, early 19th century, start doing things systematically, digging out the ground. And that means you're in the 18th century, there is no archaeology. And then you read in the Bible, and it gives you a sort of story of God having these people, Israel, and they got different enemies. And at first it's the Amorites. Then after that it's the Philistines. In my language, I say Philistines, but there we are. And then after that, it's the Syrians or Arameans, then it's the Assyrians, then it's the Babylonians, then it's the Persians. And the interesting thing is, archaeology comes along, and basically all of those people turn up in that order. And, the Amorites are really big in the second millennium BC, like in the Old Testament, and they're not big after that. Likewise, Philistines turning up around the time of David, and not a lot, not so much after that. It just works. Or you find, people say with the Exodus, there's no direct evidence. No, of course, there's no pharaoh that ever says they were defeated or anything like that. But just remember, we've only got 3 to 4 historiographical texts from all of ancient Egypt. So you've got loads and loads of writing, temples covered with spells and the glories of different kings. We do know that kings were very happy to erase each other. We know that's part of what they used to do to each other. They would damn each other's memory. That's why you can get pharaohs lost and, someone like Tutankhamun turn up again. But also, what we can say is what's stunning is you've got this Semitic grouping in the Eastern Delta in the middle of the second millennium BC at about the time that you would expect that from the Old Testament. Now, I'm not saying that is exactly the same population, but it's just that's a really interesting thing. Because in a sense, the Bible said something before archaeology began, and then, archaeology happens and that fits. Or you can look at the naming patterns. Names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are really early names. And that's an interesting thing. They're early in the Bible, but also they're names that are showing up commonly in other cultures in the early part of the biblical period and not later. So there are those sorts of things. And I would say, because the Old Testament's longer, there's actually a massive data to analyze where you can say, again, I see it hard to falsify, to explain this as falsification. Even a country saying that they used to be slaves in another country. I mean, whoever does that and it's not true. I mean, that just no, it doesn't. That's unusual. There's no national literature that says as much negative about the people group from which it originates as the Old Testament does as Israel's national literature. You know that the books of Kings were not commissioned by the kings as royal propaganda. So whereas, you look at your Egyptian temples and, go down to Abu Simbel and Ramses II is telling you how great Ramses II is, you know that Ahab didn't commission the Book of Kings to tell you his glories. He doesn't come out that well in it. So all of these sort of things are interesting, and I think you can make a big case in the Old Testament. I mean, the other thing is, what literature are we comparing this with? So what we have with Mesopotamian literature, Babylonian, Assyrian, Sumerian, fairly short stuff. And it's not all joined up. What you have with Greek, the earlier stuff that's trying to tell you a story, is something like Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. And again, they're not giving you a whole history, they're just giving you a particular focus moment. Herodotus, slightly later in Greece, begins you with history telling, and his story begins, well, some men went and raided some women from over there, and that's not really giving you the comprehensive sweep of history that you get from Genesis through to Second Kings. So I'd want to say, just at the sort of literary level, the Old Testament is doing something bigger, grander than you will find in any ancient literature, and that's already should make you sit up. And then you look at how none of the protagonists are coming out particularly well, so it doesn't seem to be propaganda. That's all interesting. It's got incredible interconnection, and then starts connecting with the New Testament. So I think you start making a case for yes, it is part of the ancient world and its literature, but for it being really something different that humans should sit up and listen to.
Along similar lines, when I had the opportunity to go to the Holy Land with a prominent Jewish thought leader, and so because I was with him, they rolled out the red carpet for us, and we got a chance to go into the actual house of King David, and they showed us the little cellar where all the signet ring would have pressed the wax into the envelope where all the letters were sent out, and they, it was amazing. And they said, this is the vantage point where he would have been able to look down at the valley and across the way, where probably Bathsheba was one of those houses right over there. And just those details, physical archaeological details that come to light being in Jerusalem, I found that to be something where it was harder for me to my head around the idea that people think it's basically just all mythology, where it's like, even the Temple Mount there, we know that that's Solomon's temple. And there's like 1,000 things if you go to Jerusalem where there's a physical marker of a cited named biblical thing, event or location, etc.
Yeah, so a very clear case there is King David. King David, first known from the Bible, and then I think it's 1993 and 1995, inscriptions come out of the ground which are mentioning him, and that's a really interesting thing. It's called the Tel Dan inscription, and you can look that up. And since then, other ancient mentions outside the Bible of David have been found, and it's or identified. So I think it's a really interesting thing that yes, you first learnt about him from the Bible. Similarly, you could go to the Louvre in Paris, museum there, and you find all about King Mesha, who's mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 3, first known from the Bible. Then out of the ground in 1868 comes this monument put up by this king. So if it's fiction, it shouldn't be your first source of information. That it shouldn't be playing that role in culture, which it is regularly. So numbers vary, but at least 60 characters from the Bible, first known from the Bible, then found in archaeology.
That's huge. I did not know that.
Yeah.
Are there any other instances that you have top of mind of where something was first described in the Bible and then archaeology supported it?
Well, we got 5 Assyrian kings, basically in the right time zones. So you're looking at Sargon, Shalmaneser, Esarhaddon, Tiglath-Pileser, and one other. And they're occurring in the right time zone. Merodach-Baladan, Babylonian king, first mentioned in the Bible, then turns up in Babylonian records. So this is regularly happening. Arabian king Geshem or Gashmu, again, first known from the Bible, then turns up in Arabian records. So, and you're getting that with pharaohs like Hofra, sometimes known as Apries, and Taharqa. Taharqa, again, you can see Taharqa shrine, you go to Oxford, and first known from the Bible, then turns up, let's say, hieroglyphs are deciphered in 1822 by Champollion. Then people can see, there's this writing Taharqa there. This is what's happening.
Are you familiar with any examples where something in archaeology directly contradicts something in scripture? I know that there's obviously a lot of gaps where we don't have an entire army of Egyptian soldiers or something like that, because it's to your point, it's extremely ancient, and you don't have archaeological support for every claim of anything from that long ago. But are you aware of any? And I'm not even begging the question. I'm just really
sure. A lot depends on the glasses you're using. If the Bible makes some really specific statements, and then humans do their archaeological calculations and make a mistake in those, and then they compare with the Bible, who's it going to look like made the mistake? It's going to look like the Bible made the mistake. That's just the nature of things. So I would say that the ancient world is a puzzle, and there are all sorts of things we don't know how they fit together. So there's a standoff between historians and archaeologists about the dating of the eruption of Thera Santorini, the island in the middle of the second millennium BC, and they stand off by about 100 years. And that's been a long-standing debate. And, is that a contradiction? Well, no, it isn't a contradiction. It's just a conundrum.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like one of those Christmas puzzles you're given, the fact that you're not able to do it straight away doesn't mean it can't be done. So I just think a lot of these things in ancient history are puzzles. And what we don't want to do is try and fit the Bible too quickly with anything. You let it have its own integrity, stand on its own. I think it stand on its own feet. It's got enough reason for it to be taken seriously, at a literary level, but also at a historical level. And then you compare it carefully with archaeology, and you've got to make sure you've got the archaeology right, because most archaeology doesn't come with lots of stories attached to it. It's a little bit here and there. You find an archive, maybe in a temple or a palace, and it will tell you a whole load about a small number of people. And then you try and work out how does that, fit with something else. So I'd say partly it's people need to chill out, and sometimes apologists need to chill out as well. Not try and fit things together too quickly. Just spend your time reading around a subject. But I just don't think there are any real defeater problems, where the tensions are so big that the Old Testament or New Testament can't be true.
You raised a really interesting point about, I guess, just raises a question in my mind of, is it because of the miraculous within the Old Testament that we even have to say something like, and then an Arabian text later was discovered that corroborated it, and therefore now it's considered legitimate? Or why, I guess what I'm curious about is, does every ancient text need a second text to support any claim being made in order for it to be considered historic, or is that only for the Bible? There
are several elements to this. I mean, firstly, I do think that history departments can be set up a bit like hedge funds. Hedge funds are set up so you don't lose money, and history departments are set up in such a way that they do incentivize skepticism. So if you look at the incentive structure within there, you will have more of a reputational hit for believing something that didn't happen than for questioning something that did happen. So that's just the way it is, and that's fine. And that means that historians are looking for extra levels of corroboration. That also means that historians would be pretty useless if you were having them on a jury about someone violating someone else. I mean, as in there are times when in case of sexual assault and so on, that you're down to one testimony, and a historian would always say, well, that's not enough. Yeah, well, you don't belong on the jury in this case, because we've got to make a decision. We've got to make a call on this. And often in life, we need to believe things based on a single testimony. That's how we work, often how we make appointments, and so on. So this idea that having corroboration is the ultimate thing in life, bit of a problem. My wife goes for a walk, comes back and said, I've been for a walk. I don't ask her, can you corroborate that? So when you're in a trusting relationship, you trust what someone says. If a good friend says they've had a really nasty time at work because one of their colleagues did this, that, and the other, you trust them unless you've found that your good friend is a consistent liar. You take that testimony and you act and sympathize accordingly. So I think that it's just worth bearing in mind that history departments are history departments. They're not that it's a great discipline to rigorously check everything and sort of create that minimalist version of things. Often if you're trying to fit the Bible into that, it won't fit, because loads of the Bible is just going to be single testimony. If I only say I only trust the Bible when I have it corroborated, I'm saying I don't trust the Bible. So what I'd say is my argument, and when I wrote this book, Can We Trust the Gospels, I was deliberately using that title, not Can We Prove the Gospels. It's about showing that at the normal level at which we trust things, this reaches it. And I'd say the Old Testament does as well. That's different from saying I can prove to a history department that this is the case, if that makes sense.
And am I right in that not only with the different books that comprise the Bible, but also with history outside of that there is often just one source telling a historic event, and people look at that source and say, oh, great, we have a record. Someone wrote about X. Or is that not...
I mean, I do think that people are historians are quite skeptical. So if you get the fall of Jerusalem, where the main source we have is Josephus, a lot of Josephus scholars would be really quite skeptical about his own account, and there's some reason for that. He had his own agenda to aggrandize himself, and let him off the hook for being, betraying his own people and so on. And so there can be some ground for that. But I think there can be a problem that hyperskepticism can be incentivized within an academic structure, and that will lead to some distortion.
Okay, that's interesting. This is going to be a little bit of a sharp turn, but I want to kind of circle back to a comment that you made like maybe 30 minutes ago in our conversation about how on the internet there's different conspiracy theories and myths and things that emerge that people basically buy into and live out of. And so for someone who would kind of say, yeah, that's essentially what the Bible is en masse, is it's like this sort of supernaturally supercharged history that, is appealing because it gives some, broad explanations of life on this planet. And it has these like sort of, Marvel-esque elements to it that appeal to people. And so that explains everything. Why or how would you respond to that type of objection?
So I want to know what sort of person is saying this. So you can get a very lazy thinker version of that. So the person doesn't even bother picking up the Bible. I mean, the Bible takes about 70 hours to read. It's not that long. And they're just sort of like folding their arms and say, well, you go and do some work. And with that person, I just say, oh, no, I'm too busy. I'm not going to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
As in, if you want to stay in your ignorance, just do. There might be consequences for that. Like if you find out you're wrong. But I think the sort of lazy version, well, it all could have just made up. I haven't read any of it. That is, I wouldn't engage too far. I mean, I do think that, again, Jesus set an example in terms of telling people not to engage if people are not showing any interest. He even talked about disciples shaking dust off their feet when they leave particular places. So I would say, no, I want someone to be serious. I am really happy to put in time into a serious conversation. I expect someone else to put in time as well. That's how humans should work together and be transformed. Now, if someone's more serious and they're looking at the great thing is we can talk detail. And so, I don't know which details we talk about. It depends which they want to take that. But we can talk about the book of Genesis. We can talk about the book of Matthew, how they think it arose. Those are sorts of things we can do because, in Matthew, we've got all sorts of quite interesting sayings. Jesus saying things like, turn the other cheek. What do they think of that? Do they think that he said it or that some smart disciple came up with this really good idea and put it on Jesus' lips? Those are basically your two options. And how does that explain other smart things in the same 12-minute block of text, Matthew 5-7, where you also get do unto others what you have them do to you and love your enemies. Let's start talking about how many really smart 12-minute blocks of text that you have anywhere from the ancient world. I just think of all the things Jesus says. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. The truth will set you free. All these sort of things. And you're finding them around the Gospels. And truth will set you free is only in John, not in the others. And so just saying we've got a really smart guy inventing things in John won't explain the ones in the other Gospels. So that's where I'd be wanting to get specific. And I think we could have really fruitful discussion.
Believe it or not, I just fully understood your point that you've been making since the start. This is how slow I am. But that somebody was a genius. Somebody changed the world. It was. I think I'm hearing you right. You can sort of say, but there is like I was kind of not totally tracking with what you were saying about the parables and all of that earlier. But I think I'm understanding your point now, which is that there is an actual culture-shaping, world-changing power and revolutionary authority inside of the Gospels that stands to be explained.
Yeah,
you right?
Yeah. So I'd say whether it's something like the parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the two sons, the prodigal son, they're both artistic works of genius. So either Jesus comes up with them or someone else comes up with them and then credits him. Those are your two choices. But to say, for instance, Luke comes up with these stories and then credits Jesus won't explain anything smart that happens in John's gospel.
I see.
That's all. And so that's where you have to start thinking, okay, you know, what's going on here? And so, I mean, a simple thing like be as wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I mean, that's a meme. That's a, you know, a smart saying. Now, given that the Gospels are only 9 hours long and a lot of it's narrative, you've only got a limited amount of text in which to mine for super smart sayings. And then you start coming out with more than Churchill ever came out with, or more than Shakespeare ever came out with. Because Shakespeare's got some nice sayings that tend to be a bit long, but about, say, the fleeting nature of life. But the fleeting nature of life is not, I mean, that's something that loads of people have observed. It's not something that's super smart to say. When Jesus says something like, the poor you will always have with you, that is just an astounding saying, because it shows an understanding of humanity. And whether you have the right or the left-wing version of why that statement is true, there's no question about the fact that it is true.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just the interesting thing that you have.
If I may, the idea that the source for these brilliant sayings that actually make civilization work its best, when the strong are serving the weak, when people are sacrificing for each other, the New Testament portrait of marriage that is given, that a man should love his wife, and all of these things that actually work and happen to be the secret sauce for humanity to run on. The idea that the source for them would be the one claiming to be the author of life itself, and the one who lived out these teachings to the nth degree, the one who himself was the ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate strong serving the weak, the ultimate turning of the other cheek. To me, I don't know if this is like a named argument or whatever, but the idea that his word and his deed were totally paired together and there was complete authenticity, that he was willing to fully live out everything that he ever asked anybody to do, and he knew that it would bear the fruit of the kingdom in this universe, but he himself first fully did it and showed us that example. I think there's something about that that's pretty profound as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And just give you one more example. People talk a lot in gender now about non-binary, okay? Now, who's the first person ever to talk about non-binary? I would say it's Jesus, because in Matthew chapter 19, he talks about 3 sorts of eunuchs, and he talks about some people are born eunuchs. Now, it doesn't mean they're not born male or female, but they are born atypically. And he already recognizes that some people are born atypically. Some people have that forced on them in their life by others. Some people choose to be eunuchs. But that's already a striking thing. You know, in the beginning, God made them male and female, but he also recognizes that there are people who are not typically male and typically female. And that's already there. You know, he does it. And so people nowadays think they've come up with something very clever. Jesus did it ages ago.
Super interesting. Well, can we end at the beginning? You mentioned Genesis, and I know we kind of just hit Matthew and stuff, but I am very interested in that. And I know that that's obviously, I mean, in many ways, maybe those first few chapters of Genesis are maybe the most important chapters of anything ever written in a certain sense. I mean, if they're true. So can we talk about Genesis? And I'm just curious, you're sort of from a historic, from the perspective that you were aiming at earlier. I'd be curious to go there.
Yes, I mean, I can't talk about anything scientific. I mean, I can simply point out that as the earliest human writing is of an economic kind. So that's what's showing up in Uruk and other places like that. But then you look at what you have in Genesis, and you can say that the sort of stories we have about creation and a flood, these are showing up as amongst the earliest human literature. So basically, as soon as the Mesopotamians are writing literature, they're writing about this sort of thing. And even, there's an old flood tablet from 1600 BC that talks about things going 2 by 2 onto a boat. So what I want to say is there is no reason why these stories can't be as old as human stories go. That's one point to make. And even something like in Genesis 10, where it talks about the earliest sort of civilization under a guy called Nimrod. The cities it mentions, like Calah, Calah, are known to be amongst the earliest cities with recorded history. So this is an interesting thing. So what I'd want to say, that I can say from my perspective and things I know about, is there's no reason why these traditions can't be very old. That I leave to scientists to talk about anything to do with science, but I'm just looking at from a historical perspective, a literary perspective.
And are you emphasizing that because there's an alternative school of thought which says that they're not old, or what's the subtext?
I mean, I think some people would see these as some of the last bits of the Bible to be written, and so on. These stories are there's no reason why they can't go back as far as human written history goes back.
I see. Man, there's so many other directions I want to go, Dr. Williams. This is so good because I feel like we're going a certain depth in many directions, and I feel like we could have a whole other podcast on every single one of these pillars that we're tackling. But is there anything that I should hit in conclusion here? Anything that you want to sort of, I don't know, a book that you want to recommend, or any last points that you want to make as we land the plane?
Well, just a couple of readable books I've written. So one is The Surprising Genius of Jesus. So half of that is about Luke 15 and about just the depths that there are of that, and how it's like a masterpiece. It's a 3-minute masterpiece, the story of two sons, and I think it goes into a deeper analysis than you'd often have. And then this one's in 15 languages. Can we trust the Gospels? And I'd also say we've got a great podcast at Tyndale House. So if people go tyndalehouse.com/subscribe, you can find all sorts of things, including a podcast. We got one on ancient names at the moment. We got a whole study of that, and we got real ancient cuneiform scholars and ancient specialists who are taking us through all the different names there are in the Bible, and that as an angle on what's going on in the history. And so, I'd certainly recommend that.
Very interesting. I will put links to all of the above in the description of this video for anyone interested. And thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It's been great to be with you.